We often think about American history in these, huge, broad strokes, big events, manifest destiny, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But sometimes, to really get a feel for the scale, the sheer human persistence of it all, you need to zoom way in. You need to follow a single family tree, see how its roots spread.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're taking a deep dive into the story of one family line, the descendants of Isaac DuBose. Or, if you trace it back even further, Isaac Dubosc from France. And what looks like maybe a narrow genealogy project at first glance just explodes.
Right, it becomes this massive story spanning, what, 2 continents, 3 centuries?
Pretty much. It's all in there. Religious persecution, leaving everything behind, crossing an ocean, then this relentless push across America, shaping the South, then heading west. It's quite the journey.
So the sources we're using here, they seem pretty expensive. Genealogical records, notes, histories.
Oh, absolutely. It's a rich collection. And our goal really isn't just to list names and dates. We want to pull out the patterns, understand the why behind this family's movement. How do you go from fleeing France in the 1600s to establishing this dynasty in South Carolina and then packing up again for the exodus to Texas?
It really feels like a story about endurance, doesn't it? Following this one family, you mentioned they traced it up to the 12th generation.
Yeah, right into the late 20th century. You find names like Lynn and Rochelle DuBose. It's huge. But to understand that drive, that grit that took them across the Gulf Coast into Texas, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the trauma, the conviction that forced them into exile.
Okay, let's do that. Let's start unpacking this journey. Part 1, the Huguenot Genesis, the Great Flight. So the DuBose family, or Dubosc, their story starts in 17th century France. What exactly pushed them out? What was the spark?
The spark, or maybe the explosion, was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. See, this earlier edict from 1598 had given French Protestants, the Huguenots, some basic rights, some tolerance. When Louis XIV canceled it, he basically outlawed Protestantism, full stop.
And that triggered this huge crackdown.
A massive state-sponsored effort. The goal was simple: convert or get out. Or worse, this is what caused that huge wave of emigration, the one that carried the DuBose ancestors away from France.
Sources really emphasize this wasn't just like a political blunder. It was self-destructive for France.
Oh, totally. An extraordinary lack of foresight. France lost hundreds of thousands of its most skilled people. Artisans, merchants, thinkers, gone. But it was the methods they used. That's what really broke things. That's what forced families like the DuBose to make that impossible choice.
Right. The records get pretty specific and disturbing about the persecution. It sounds systematic, almost psychological warfare aimed right at the family unit.
It absolutely was. They attacked the home, your work, and crucially, your children. The most notorious tactic was the dragonnades.
That's where they quartered soldiers in Protestant homes.
Exactly. Royal dragoons, basically given free rein to intimidate, harass, destroy property, make life unbearable until you converted. They acted with complete impunity, physical abuse, psychological torture. It was brutal.
A way to enforce conversion using the state's muscle without, ordering mass executions directly. Very insidious.
Precisely. And then there was the economic pressure, huge fines, being banned from professions, doctors, lawyers, craftsmen. You basically couldn't make a living unless you gave up your faith. But maybe the most traumatic part, the thing the sources always highlight, was taking the children.
That's chilling. Forcibly removing kids.
Yes. The government decreed they could take Huguenot children, put them in Catholic institutions, raise them Catholic. The accounts describe these horrific scenes, officials dragging away screaming children, parents powerless. Imagine living with that constant fear for generations. The state could literally steal your child.
The goal was clearly to break the family, break the identity itself.
To completely erase the Huguenot identity by shattering the family structure. Yes.
So when you're faced with that, exile, prison, losing your kids.
Yeah.
It must create this intense selection pressure. It wasn't just anyone who fled.
No, definitely not. It was a kind of spiritual and moral survival of the fittest. The descriptions we have of these immigrants are really consistent. They're called people of piety, integrity, courage, and capacity.
Yeah.
They resisted incredible pressure with undaunted spirit and inflexible determination.
So these weren't broken people fleeing. They were the determined ones, the resilient ones.
Exactly. They chose the incredibly risky path of escape, if caught, death, prison, or being condemned to the galleys, basically, becoming a slave rower on naval ships. So that strength, that character, that capacity, that's the inheritance they carried with them across the Atlantic.
Okay, so they make the break, they survive the journey. South Carolina ends up being the stronghold for the DuBose line, but were there other places Huguenots tried first?
Oh yes, they scattered initially. There were early attempts, settlements in New York, place called New Rochelle, families like the Boudinot's went there, maybe drawn by trade. But apparently it didn't always pan out economically, so some moved south. Virginia also got a share. King William's Parish is mentioned. We see records of people dying there early on, like a Pierre Morisset in 1734. But these often felt temporary.
But South Carolina,
Yeah.
that's where things stuck for the DuBose line. Why there? What made it the right place?
Several things, probably. Land was available, and crucially, South Carolina offered a relatively more tolerant religious atmosphere, which was, the whole point for them. The key spot for the DuBose family seems to be the Orange Quarter. Later, it became St. Denis Parish. It was near Charleston, along the Cooper River.
The name Orange Quarter. Yeah. That sounds significant, given the politics of the time.
It almost certainly is. Very likely a tribute to William of Orange. He was a major Protestant figure in Europe, seen as a protector. And what's really telling about the DuBose family's character, and the Huguenots generally, is that they set up churches immediately, like first thing.
Wow, not focused on houses or land first, but worship.
Exactly. It shows that core motivation, that religious drive, was still paramount. They didn't just flee from persecution. They fled to practice their faith freely. It connects that original trauma directly to their new life.
Makes sense. They built their new stability around their faith.
Right. And there was another important Huguenot settlement up the Santee River, about 70 families there. Contemporary accounts describe them as really temperate, industrious. They apparently did very well very quickly.
Better than the English settlers, even.
That's what some sources say. Even though they often arrived with less money or fewer possessions, a key factor seems to have been mutual assistance among themselves.
Ah, that shared experience creating a strong community.
Precisely. They helped each other, shared labor, maybe provided credit. It created this tight-knit network that gave them a real advantage. That capacity they were noted for wasn't just individual, it was communal. And that ability to organize, to pool resources, that really sets the stage for the next couple of centuries.
Okay, so that initial grit gets them established. But turning that refugee resilience into lasting influence, into part of the establishment, that's the next chapter. Let's move into part 2, the South Carolina stronghold and the path west.
Right. So if the late 1600s were about flight and finding refuge, the 1700s were about putting down deep roots. For generations, the DuBose family became really embedded in South Carolina. They transitioned from French refugees to, established Southern planters. Agriculture was key.
Where exactly in South Carolina did they settle most densely? What were the core areas?
You see a few key counties emerge as the family's heartland. Williamsburg County, especially around a place called Hebron, was really central. And you can see how some branches just stayed put there. They became the anchor. We find records, for instance, of a Martha Jane DuBose, born 1846, and Mary Isabella DuBose, born 1850. They lived their whole lives, died right there in Hebron, resisted that later westward pull.
So a solid core remained even as others eventually moved on. What other areas were important?
Darlington District was another major one. That's where we see figures like Rupert Cole DuBose and Louisa Narcisse DuBose, born in the late 1840s, early 1850s. Darlington maybe represents the slightly more restless side of the family, the ones who'd eventually look west. And Clarendon County, too. Families like the Robinsons, who intermarried with the DuBoses, had a long presence there. It shows these dense, interconnected communities.
Okay, so they've really made it, from exiles on the coast to fixtures of the South Carolina landscape, tied into the agricultural economy. But then the 19th century arrives. Land gets scarcer. America's pushing west. That old restlessness seems to bubble up again.
It really does. That capacity for movement, maybe inherited from their Huguenot ancestors, kicks back in. The 1800s see the first major migration out of South Carolina, the target, the deep south, specifically Alabama and Mississippi. The motivation this time wasn't religious freedom, it was economic. Fresh, fertile land, especially for cotton. The Carolina soil was getting depleted.
Was there a key figure, someone who sort of spearheaded this move west?
The records point strongly to Benjamin DuBose, born back in Darlington County, South Carolina, around 1770. He makes the big move to Marengo County, Alabama, dies there in 1851. His move basically plants the flag for the huge Alabama branch of the family. And it wasn't just him. His son, Joel Campbell DuBose, moved his family from Darlington to Alabama in 1838, too. It was a calculated family migration.
So Marengo County, Alabama's the beachhead. Did they spread out from there within Alabama?
Oh, yeah. They established several key centers. Coffee County became pretty significant. You see people moving there from South Carolina, like Rupert Cole DuBose, who died there in 1886. Louise and Narcisse DuBose married and lived there too. It shows these new settlements acted like magnets.
And were there other major hubs in Alabama?
Franklin County, further west, became another dense settlement area. Records show Porter DuBois noticed the slight spelling change there, Duboise, born 1859, and Newton Elloyd DuBois, born 1861. Born, lived, died, all in Franklin County.
That little spelling shift is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it signals something, like they're becoming fully Americanized, maybe less tied to the original French Huguenot identity, names changing based on local records or pronunciation.
Exactly. Moving beyond those coastal Huguenot cultural centers. But that journey itself, hundreds of miles, wagons, families, livestock, it must have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And dangerous.
The sources sometimes capture these really stark, specific moments, don't they? They do. There's this one incredibly brief, tragic note about the journey to Alabama. It just says, a DuBose man died en route because, quote, he was kicked in the head by a mule and his neck was broken.
Wow. Just like that. It's brutal, but it really grounds the whole migration, doesn't it? It wasn't some romantic adventure. It was full of real, sudden dangers.
Absolutely. It underscores that this westward push was high risk. It took that same kind of determination, that fortitude the original Huguenots had. Only now the risk wasn't for religious freedom, but for economic opportunity, for land, for their children. And this wasn't just Alabama. You see parallel moves happening. James L. DuBose, born around 1866, ends up in Lauderdale County, Mississippi. Samuel E. DuBose, born 1868, is over in Perry County, Arkansas.
So multiple lines pushing west simultaneously, all stemming from that South Carolina base.
That's right, conquering the frontier on multiple fronts.
Okay, we've got the strong SC core, the pioneers breaking into Alabama and Mississippi.
Yeah.
That sets the stage perfectly for the next big leap. Part 3, the exodus to Texas and the enduring legacy. Texas looms large in the American imagination, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Oh, Texas was the dream for many. Huge amounts of land, new railroads popping up, opportunities in cattle, farming, later oil. It was a powerful magnet, and the DuBose descendants really moved there in force. It shows how adaptable they were, taking their skills into this vast new landscape.
Can we track where they settled in Texas? Was it concentrated or did they spread out?
They really seem to spread out, almost covering the state. You find them centrally located, like in Eastland County. The town of Carbon there seems to have been a significant destination. Charles James DuBose was born there in 1887, Velma Fern DuBose in 1902, and Charles James later died down in Austin, which shows that shift from rural settling to integrating into the cities too.
Okay, that's Central Texas. What about further west, like the Panhandle?
Yep, they made it out there too, into ranching country and later oil territory, Terry County, for example. Charles Sidney DuBose, who'd come from Alabama, died out in Brownfield in 1947. That highlights the multi-step migration pattern, South Carolina to Alabama, then Alabama to Texas, always looking for the next opportunity.
And closer to the center and down towards the coast as well?
Definitely. Bell County, near Waco, specifically a place called Little River. Theodore Barber DuBose, born there in 1936, George Russell DuBose in 1943, and then later in the 20th century, you see them pushing further south towards the Gulf and the border. Robert Byron DuBose Sr., born 1912 in Rialitos down in Duval County, eventually died in Corpus Christi. So you see the range. Eastland, Panhandle, Central Texas, Gulf Coast. They were everywhere.
It feels like less of a purely farming migration by this point, and more about seizing whatever economic chances Texas offered. And this wasn't just individual families moving in isolation, right? They moved as networks.
Absolutely. That old Huguenot idea of mutual assistance seems to carry through. You see allied families, people they'd intermarried with back in SC or Alabama making the same journey. The Cole family is a good example, connected to the DuBoses back east. John Montgomery Cole, born in Alabama or Louisiana, ends up dying out in Colorado City, Mitchell County, Texas in 1954. These family networks provided support, maybe capital, definitely companionship on these tough moves.
Speaking of specifics, there's that little geographical note in the sources that adds some color.
Yes, just a tiny detail, but it makes it feel real. A note says that Zigzag is near Devine, Texas. It just reminds you that these huge migrations are made up of countless little places, specific spots on the map where people built lives.
Now, to fuel this kind of expansion across generations and vast territories, they must have had large families. What does the record say about their demographics?
Oh, the family sizes were often enormous, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. It fit the needs of an agricultural society. More kids meant more help, more security. The scale could be pretty staggering. There's one figure mentioned, John DuBose, who apparently had 17 children between his two wives.
17. Wow.
Okay.
That explains how they could spread out so effectively.
Exactly. That provided the sheer numbers needed to settle and work all that new land in the Deep South and then Texas. It really speaks to that resilience again, that capacity not just to survive, but to multiply and thrive.
That capacity seems to be the through line from the Huguenot refugees onwards.
Absolutely. And you can trace it right down the generations. We mentioned it goes to the 12th generation by the late 20th century, people like Lynn and Rochelle DuBose carrying the name forward.
And did the westward movement stop at Texas? Or did that restlessness push them even further?
It didn't stop. The ultimate reach, the final expression of that westward impulse, took them all the way to the Pacific. We find descendants settling in California. Velma Fern DuBose, who was born back in Carbon, Texas, she married in San Diego in 1920, a clear move west. And later, Barbara Lynn Rogers, born in Santa Monica, Los Angeles County, in 1965. So that journey that started with a flight across the Atlantic for religious reasons ends with descendants reaching the Pacific coast, driven purely by, opportunity and the American dream, right to the edge of the continent.
That's an incredible arc, geographically and chronologically, but just tracing lines on a map isn't the whole story. We need to understand their impact. Let's move into part 4, lives and contributions. How did these DuBose descendants actually shape the communities they settled in? What roles did they play?
Yeah, this is where you see that ingrained character, the piety, the integrity, the capacity really showing up in American life. We see it in military service from the Civil War right through World War II, and also in professions like medicine, law, business.
Okay, let's start with the Civil War. By the 1860s, they were deeply established in places like South Carolina and Alabama. How involved were they in the Confederacy?
They were fully integrated into Southern society by that point. The transition from refugee to established planter class was complete. So yes, the records show numerous DuBose family members, and those from connected families served in the Confederate States Army, the CSA. Names like John Allen Hornsby, William Walton DuBose, Pulaski DuBose Cole, Jesse Knighton DuBose Sr. are listed. It shows a deep commitment to the Southern cause, the society they built.
That does raise an interesting point for us to consider, doesn't it? Their ancestors fled persecution for religious freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yet within a few generations, they seem fully integrated into the Southern hierarchy, which of course included the institution of slavery. How do we square that circle?
That's probably the central tension in this family's story, and maybe for many Southern families with similar origins. It seems the drive for stability, for economic success, for political integration. It overshadowed the historical memory of being persecuted outsiders. The Huguenots brought skills and a strong work ethic, and they applied that capacity to mastering the system they found themselves in, which in the 18th and 19th century South was an agrarian, slave-holding economy. They assimilated very effectively into the existing power structure because that was the path to success and security. We see others listed too, like Ludlow Bowman Baynard, CSA, born in Louisiana, showing the deep involvement across the Deep South branches.
It's a complex picture. That shift from conviction to commerce, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, fast forward a few generations. That military tradition clearly continued, right, into the 20th century's major conflicts.
Yes, and with remarkable distinction. The record of Albert L. James Jr. from the South Carolina branch is particularly striking in World War II. He served as a major in Europe. He was part of the D-Day invasion at Normandy.
Wow, right in the thick of it.
Absolutely. His honors really tell the story. The invasion arrowhead, 5 battle campaign stars, the Bronze Star, and completing a historical circle, the French Croix de Guerre.
That's incredible. A descendant of French refugees, honored by France itself for helping liberate it from tyranny generations later.
What about other fields? Did that emphasis on education and capacity translate into professional success?
Very much so. They maintained a strong presence in the learned professions. There's John Elias Isaiah DuBose, who impressively held both MD and DD degrees, Doctor of Medicine and Doctor of Divinity, bridging science and faith. And in business and finance, you have figures like Robert Gignilliat Keenan Jr. He went to Vanderbilt, then Harvard Business School, became a successful independent investor in Birmingham, Alabama, so operating at high levels of modern commerce.
And Albert L. James Jr., the WWII hero, he also had a significant legal career back in South Carolina. Extremely distinguished. Graduated Phi Beta Kappa from law school at the University of South Carolina, became a law partner. And significantly, he served as a special circuit court judge and spent 12 years on the South Carolina Board of Bar Examiners. really contributing to the state's legal structure.
Before we wrap up, let's touch on some of those specific personal details the sources capture, the things that make these historical figures feel more human.
Yes, those little biographical nuggets are great. Like Richard Ellie DuBose Jr. from Alabama. He was a shopping center developer, quite successful. But when he died relatively recently in 2020, his obituary included this wonderful detail. It mentioned he was survived by his, quote, beloved dog, Atticus Finch DuBose.
Atticus Finch DuBose. That's fantastic. It tells you something about his personality, right?
Yeah.
Connection to Southern literature, maybe a sense of humor.
Exactly. Grounds these big historical figures in everyday life. And that thread of religious commitment and community involvement also continued strongly. Well, take Mrs. T. Durward DuBose, also from Alabama. She had a career in healthcare administration, retired as a vice president at Baptist Health Services in 1989. But alongside that, she was deeply involved in her church, 12th Street Baptist Church. Involved in the music program, directed the senior Sunday school department. It shows that intense piety that started the whole journey. It didn't disappear. It remained a core part of family life for many, right through the generations.
And the clergy itself remained a path for some.
It did. That tradition continued. We noted that the marriage of John Elias Isaiah DuBose, the doctor and minister, was performed by another DuBose, the Reverend Julius J. DuBose. So the family kept producing its own spiritual leaders to serve its sprawling community.
This has been quite a journey, a really comprehensive deep dive. We've covered centuries, continents, huge social shifts, all through the lens of this one remarkable family.
It really is the DuBose thread, isn't it? Stretching from those religious wars in 16th century France across the ocean to South Carolina's coast, pushing into the heart of the Deep South, Alabama's cotton fields, and then finally spreading across the massive landscapes of Texas, urban and rural. It's like American expansion in miniature.
And the core takeaway seems to be about the lasting power of conviction, maybe. Those 17th century Huguenots chose exile, chose suffering for their beliefs.
Right. And that resilience, that character, that capacity for hard work and helping each other, it didn't just vanish once they were safe, it transformed. It became the engine for their success in America, fueling that huge 19th century expansion. This family story really shows how that initial quest for freedom, religious, intellectual, paved the way for incredible economic growth and demographic spread. They learned how to survive, definitely, and then they really learned how to thrive.
Which brings us to a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. The first migration from France was driven by persecution, saving their souls, escaping tyranny, often losing everything materially. But that later migration, the big push from South Carolina out to Alabama, Mississippi, and especially Texas, that seems driven primarily by opportunity, by land, by commerce, by getting ahead. You see it in the number of doctors, lawyers, developers later on.
So here's the question. Does the fundamental character of a family's movement, their exodus, change when the motivation shifts? From escaping danger to seeking profit? Did that original spiritual conviction just sort of morph into a powerful capacity for hard work, for risk-taking, that then fueled their success in building America? And maybe, just maybe, isn't that drive, that adaptability, one of the defining traits of the American pioneer experience itself?
Something to think about, definitely. Tracing those vast historical currents back to the choices and the character of individuals.
Huh?
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.